This is the podcast of ENCACT, the European Network on Cultural Management and Policy. In this series, we interview extraordinary professionals from the cultural management and policy community. Join us to hear their stories, the secrets of their success, and their advice for creating innovation by inspiring new policies and practices in the cultural, education, and research sector.
A big welcome to all of our listeners around the world to the ENCATC Academy podcast series. I'm Pravali Bangeti, the Policy and Communications Officer at ENCAT, and this podcast is part of a special series in which we talk with inspiring leaders committed to contributing to the sustainability of the cultural and creative sectors. This series of podcasts is being registered in the framework of the ENCAT Academy on Sustainable Cultural Management and Policy, which took place in April 2024 in Lille, France. These conversations with cultural leaders are meant to inspire current and future generations of practitioners in developing new sustainable practices and policies. So join us as we go on to this journey. For this podcast, I had the opportunity to sit down with Iphigenia Taxopoulou, who is a pioneer in the climate action discourse in the cultural and creative industries. She's the General Secretary of European Theatre Network, Meetos 21. During the podcast, we had the opportunity to discuss the very crucial topic of capacity building on the green transformation in the performing arts sector. Iphigenia, it's an absolute pleasure to have you with us. Welcome to the podcast.
Hello, everybody. Hi, Pravali. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to work with ENCAT in the framework of what has been a very consistent engagement with sustainability over the past few years. So I'm very happy to be here with you.
Thank you so much. All right, let us jump right into our first topic of conversation today, which is about training and education in the greening of performing arts sector. I think we can all agree that the need for sustainability in the performing arts sector and in the culture sector at large is no longer a debate. We all understand that this is a prerequisite, and yet we find that there is a massive gap in addressing this issue when it comes to the curricula of education and training programs. And I wanted to ask you why you think that is.
Well, indeed, there is a paradox, and it is a paradox that those of us who have been working in the field of sustainability and culture for quite some time have been puzzling over, to be honest. But it's not only a gap that one can see in education. Until recently, there has been a gap in addressing the issue in the practice of the culture sector in general. But specifically in the educational field, I think this has a twofold approach. The culture sector, to a large degree, has built the educational frameworks connected to the young professionals, very much based on practice. So, in a sense, we see that the young professionals are being trained through the old models of doing things. Therefore, they are actually reproducing the things that we need to change. And it is only after they finish their studies, once they get into the professional field, that they start to need to forget what they learned and relearn in the context of the climate crisis. So we are, I think, in a transitional period where there is a generational gap where the trainers are not trained to be able to train the young professionals, taking into account the different principles and approaches of sustainability. Which means that, as I said before, we are producing new generations of culture practitioners in all the different fields of culture. In some fields, it's more acute, the problem, and in other fields, it's less serious. But on the whole, we are really lagging behind. Now, this is not something that is just my impression. If you take an overview of the variety of culture courses in performing arts, drama schools, academies, culture management, policy courses, and so on and so forth, it is very clear that the aspect of sustainability, or what we call ecological transition, has not yet been integrated. And when we find it, which perhaps later on in our conversation we might look at some examples, it is rarely integrated as an umbrella idea of studies. It is very often an add-on. So I think this describes a little bit the reasons behind this gap that we see between the necessity to move to a different way of practice and the offer of knowledge and capacity building to the people that need to go through this transition.
It's very interesting that you mentioned that. And of course, we will get deeper into the conversation about these curricula that are lagging behind. But what is interesting is what you started your conversation with, which is that forget the academies that are training people to become future practitioners, but even the existing culture sector dynamics have not fully integrated sustainability as a way of practice. So do you think, or in your experience while you've worked with all of these organizations, are there some best practice examples that come up in the performing arts sector where they've already successfully integrated this sustainability and a green approach to all of their activities? And then how may we connect that to training and capacity building?
So yes, of course, there are brilliant examples of culture organizations that have embedded sustainability already from maybe 30 years ago. Of course, between, let's say, the early 90s and the late 2010, there were not so many examples. And those that existed were, in a sense, scattered around the globe and did not so much interact with each other. And that perhaps did not create a more massive movement of cultural practitioners that would be working along the principles of sustainability. However, of course, after 2019, with Greta Thunberg, the Fridays for Future movement, which brought the topic of climate crisis on the headlines, and then, of course, the very big shift of direction of the European Union towards the EU Green Deal. So this created a completely different environment where, of course, now we have many, many more best practice examples. I would like to mention perhaps one example, which is one of the best and oldest examples in sustainable practice, and which is very much connected to our discussion about capacity building. And that is the multi-arts venue home in Manchester, United Kingdom. Well, United Kingdom has been a pioneer in the cultural sector following the path of ecological transition. So it's not an accident that a UK institution is here used as an example. So Home has been working on their sustainability policy in every aspect of the functioning of the institution, from the building to the programming, to what they serve in the restaurants, to how they commute, and so on and so forth, for more than 10 years. So I would say that it's a fantastic example of embedding environmental sustainability across all the areas of an organization. What is interesting about Home, and makes it an even more interesting example to follow, is that they paid so much attention, they invested so much on the training and capacity building of the people working in the house. It is actually the first arts and cultural venue in the world to have 100% of its staff trained in what they call carbon literacy. So there is in the UK an organization which is called the Carbon Literacy Project that offers environmental training to different kinds of organizations, including for the national sector. The National Theatre in London is another organization that have been systematically offering their staff carbon literacy training. The idea behind that is, unless you have people who know the jargon of carbon literacy, of the ecological transition, and understand what are the stakes, and then can actually understand better the methodologies of dealing with the crisis and how this translates into their own work, into their work environment and their particular task, you can go so far. But for whom it has proved a real boost in their sustainability ambition, they now have in-house trainers who deliver regular workshops, and they make sure that even all the new starters are trained within like 6 months of joining the home team. So the idea is to have a constant stream of training and retraining everybody. And it seems, as they report, the organization reports in their annual assessment of their progress, that it has been so inspiring and such an enforcement to their commitment for accountability and responsibility in terms of the environment.
Thank you. That does seem like a very pioneering example. I just want to dig deeper. Are there any other examples that come to mind from any other part of Europe or elsewhere that might not be as established in their practice, but somebody, let's say an organization that's starting to look into this sort of work?
Yes, I would bring an example from, again, of course, we are in the field of retraining people. So this means that the cultural sector as it is practically occupied by workers, cultural professionals who have not had, of course, that's normal, who have not had proper environmental training in the studies. That's why this is an additional offer by organizations. 15 years ago, the Broadway Green Alliance, to just go to an example in the United States, the Broadway Green Alliance was founded in New York with the aim to train people in the Broadway theater sector to be able to offer green advice to the different productions running on Broadway. Now, this project has been so successful, they built what they called the Green Captains Training Program. Now, the Green Captains are members from different production teams from Broadway productions who are offered training and capacity building by the Broadway Green Alliance. And so they can go back to the productions. Usually these productions have a much longer run and offer their services as the green officers of each production. In their latest report, because Broadway Green Alliance now work beyond Broadway, there are about 800 trained green captains across the US working in different theaters, in different productions. So that is quite a wonderful major project that does bring tangible change. Other than that, yes, there are, I think, quite a few training programs that have been designed. To begin with, we as Mythos 21, we began to be engaged in matters of sustainability about 10 years ago. And it became very clear, as we have just been discussing, that one of the major challenges for our membership was that people did not really know what to do. People in the cultural sector almost invariably extremely interested in dealing with big issues, let alone the climate crisis. But there has always been a question coming from our colleagues. Where do we start? What to do? Again, people who had been working in the cultural sector for many years, so they had to transition to a different way of working, but they didn't have the capacity, the skills to do so. So we built in 2016, we designed a course which we called the Sustainable Cultural Management course. And this was designed to offer cultural professionals the basic knowledge around climate and environmental issues, and then how these can be translated into practice in the way we are working in the cultural sector, from buildings to daily operations, to touring productions, to staging productions, to programming. So we tried to create a training course that would offer an overview of sustainable practice for cultural professionals. So I think that was one of the very first examples of trainings. In the course of the years, Julie's Bicycle created another program, which is called the Creative Climate Leadership course. Creative Carbon Scotland have also been offering a series of training courses to the cultural sector in Scotland. And these are examples of retraining professionals.
Right. And this was going to be my next question as well, because all of these programs, and it's wonderful what you just said about Meters 21 and the program, it sounds like an orientation course that must be given to every cultural professional who graduates from an academic institution and starts to work in an organization. So in the real world, as we say, this should be one of the first things they learn about. But they shouldn't really have to, because this should be taught in the academic programs. Ideally, if things were more structured, then these courses should have been integrated somehow in these cultural management and policy programs that we see coming up everywhere. So my next question was, are there examples of, academic programs that are already integrating these topics so that there isn't as much a need for retraining, but that the professionals who are graduating, the students who are graduating, already have a cursory knowledge of how to integrate sustainability, and then they can build on that depending on which organization or which sector they get into?
Well, we have, unfortunately, very few examples of that. I would mention, for example, the York University in Toronto. There is a special program on ecological design for performance, and that is taught by Professor Ian Garrett, who himself is an artist and an expert in sustainability. So this is one of the very few cases where you have a trained trainer who is at the same time knowledgeable in the art and in the art of sustainable art. And I think, as I said, training the trainers should be the first priority. Otherwise, you can only integrate sustainability in the curricula as an add-on. Another example of a very deeply integrated sustainability practice would be the Barnard College in New York, where again, another artist and sustainability expert, Sandra Goldmark, is overseeing the productions of the theater department there. So students there get immersed into sustainability and art from scratch. So the two things go together. They don't sort of follow each other. The Royal Holloway recently have introduced in their theatre studies a quite robust approach to sustainability, which also, interestingly enough, they are integrating with the college's environmental policy as a whole. So that seems to come closer to a more holistic approach. There are a few examples of performing arts academies that are trying to offer their students sustainability courses, but on the side. So, for example, two of our members in Meters 21, the Academy of Ludwigsburg and the Academy of the Thomas Bernhard Theatre Institute in the Mozarteum, they have tried consistently to do at least one seminar per year for the students. But again, you see, we have not reached the point where the ecological transition informs the entire curriculum, as we tend to see more in other areas, for instance, architecture or mechanical engineering, where the world is moving so fast that you really cannot work in these areas without taking into account the different aspects of sustainability that are related to those particular fields. So I think we have a long way to go.
I can imagine. And, already I think for the listeners of this podcast, they've such a rich list of resources that you've mentioned in terms of programs, whether it's for, early professionals, emerging professionals, or in those who are enrolled in academic courses. There is a lot of progress in terms of integrating sustainability, not just as an add-on to the course, but like a true integration. But we wanted to end this podcast on a more hopeful note. And because you have a very diverse view of how it has been on the practitioner side and on the academic side, here's an open-ended question, which is, what do you think is the ideal way forward for these professionals to not come into the workforce and suddenly being presented with something that seems completely new. What is the way that one can address this in a systematic way, whether it's through policy or through education?
Well, policy is one thing for sure. It's very important because it does provide the framework that sometimes is needed to impose these changes. And in this sense, the fact that we have more and more strict policy frameworks, from the Paris Agreement to the European Green Deal to the different national legislations, this will inevitably be mirrored sooner or later in the curricula, not just of the performing arts and the cultural sector in general, but across the different stages of educational systems. On the other hand, this needs to happen sooner rather than later. And for this, I think there are two things for the training and education area of the cultural sector. One is that the older ones need to demonstrate greater intergenerational solidarity. So we need, as trainers, to make an effort to become more familiar with these new trends so that we can help the younger generations to transition faster and easier. But the hopeful thing is that the younger generations might not have yet the skills, the capacity to practice sustainability in their chosen fields of action, but they already have the different mindset that is necessary. So what sometimes is lacking from the older generations, because we were conditioned in different times and with a different mindset that did not include the ecological crisis, the younger generations do possess this mindset. So I'm hopeful that this interaction between expertise and dynamic transitioning force towards a better, more ecological future will at some point accelerate change. And this hopefully will also be reflected in the field of education.
Thank you, Iphigenia. It really is a very positive note for us to bring this podcast to a close with. Indeed, we see it in practice that the younger generations are a lot more aligned to the idea of sustainability because it seems very inherent to their way of living and not something that they must work out of their way to achieve. So it remains our hope. And also, it is our personal hope that every person who's listening to this podcast and all the educators and trainers who are part of our membership who will have access to this podcast are able to, pay closer attention to your words and better integrate everything that you have said into their curricula in the future. Thank you so much for taking the time today.
Well, it's a pleasure. Thank you so much to you, Pravali, and to ENCATC. Good luck with the rest of the work on sustainability. Thank you.
You have been listening to the podcast of ENCACT, the European Network on Cultural Management and Policy. To learn more about us, our activities, and how to become a member, visit encact.org.